topic for this session is, why should I care about anyone else but myself? Why should I care about anyone's interests but my own? And this connects to the issue I mentioned yesterday of agent-relative versus agent-neutral value. So the question is, when I say that something is good or right or valuable or something, is that simply a relational claim, a claim that it's good for, let's say, for me, good from my point of view, or is it somehow an endorsement of some kind of shared or commonly accessible value? So you might think of it this way. When I say the word I, I'm referring to me. And when you say the word I, you're referring to yourself. It's not, it's not that the meaning of the word I is, subjective in some odd way. It's, there's some sense in which we all mean exactly the same thing by the word I, but nevertheless the reference is always different. When I say I mean me. When you say I mean you mean you. So you might think, someone might think, well, maybe good is like that. When I say good, I mean good for me. When you say good, you mean good for you. Now, praxeology might seem to favor this agent-relative conception, because praxeology talks about the fact that the values you pursue are always your own values. Classical eudaimonism also might seem to favor that view, because classical eudaimonism says we each have our own eudaimonia, we each have our own flourishing that we're pursuing. And in fact, Aristotle even suggests that good is sort of a relational concept. He attacks Plato's form of the good as some sort of good in itself. He says, no, good is always the perfection of something. My good is to perfect my nature, your good is to perfect your nature, and so on. And if you look at cases like the squirrel eating the acorn, you might say, well, that good or bad thing? Well, it's good for the squirrel, bad for the acorn. It seems like there's an agent-relative conception there. On the other hand, when we think about justice and rights, it seems like it's awfully tempting, at least, to think that you need something like an agent-neutral conception there. Unless you want sort of a purely kind of egoist contractarianism or something, where you say, well, I decide it's in my interest to make this agreement with other people that will all sort of agree not to violate each other's rights. But you might think, well, maybe you want something more robust than that. Maybe there's some reason I ought to respect your rights apart from the fact that it's simply a strategy that serves my ends. And if it is, if I should somehow adopt respect for your rights or for your interests or whatever, some kind of inherent value, then that might seem to push you in the direction of agent-neutral value. So there's the question, why should we care about other people? And then there's this other question, is all value agent-relative? Is all value agent-neutral? How are these two kinds of value related? So here's a question you might ask. If you think of, Nietzsche makes this distinction between master morality and slave morality, where master morality, I'm going to oversimplify a bit, in the long tradition of oversimplifying Nietzsche. Master morality involves values, people who go around dominating and going after what they want and imposing their will and being aggressive and self-assertive. And slave values or servile values involve being meek and not putting yourself forward and being humble and gentle and doing what other people want rather than what you want and so on. So slave values or servile values are self-sacrificial, and what you're supposed to admire, not just what you're supposed to do for yourself, but what you're supposed to admire in other people, is sort of self-abasingness. Whereas for master morality, you're supposed to not only what you're supposed to pursue for yourself, but what you're supposed to find admirable in other people is a kind of self-assertiveness. But you might ask, well, why shouldn't I endorse master morality for myself and for other people I care about, if any? And why shouldn't I endorse servile values for everyone else? Maybe what I should endorse for myself and my friends is bold self-assertiveness. But what I should endorse for everybody else is meek self-abasingness. Now, I want other people to be helpful to me. And so I like it when other people are really helpful and they sacrifice their interests to me. But I don't want to do that stuff. I want to go after what I want. So is there any reason not to adopt a double set of values? One set of values for you and your gang and another set of values for the rest of the world. If you think value is agent relative, you might think that nothing would rule that out. Now, The existing evaluative terms we actually use seem to be agent neutral, I claim. Well, I'm claiming that they seem to be. I'm not claiming that they are, but I'm claiming that they seem to be, which by itself could still be a disputable claim. But what I mean by that is that when we say that something is good or right, we're generally not merely endorsing it for ourselves or expressing our own desire for it, but generally we're also endorsing it for others, saying that other people ought to want it or respect it or whatever. Now, the fact that our evaluative terms actually work that way doesn't by itself prove anything. We might have our evaluative terms might conceal some sort of confusion, but nevertheless, I'm claiming that in fact our evaluative terms do tend to work that way. Not only do they express our own desire or approval for things, but they also tend to suggest that other people should feel similarly. Now, you might think, well, this isn't true generally. You might think, well, what about cultures that have a double standard? Nietzsche, for example, talks about cultures that had master morality for the in-group. You're supposed to, you're not only are you supposed to behave self-assertively yourself, you're supposed to admire self-assertion among your fellow gang and want them to be like that too. But you're not supposed to admire it in the rest of the world. You're not supposed to want the rest of the world to be self-assertive. You want the rest of the world to be meek and humble. You're perfectly happy with the fact that the rest of the world is meek and humble and you're self-assertive. And so Nietzsche thinks that, at least in cultures like that, evaluative terms aren't universal in that way. That evaluative terms, although they may involve a recommendation for someone other than just you personally yourself, they don't involve recommendations for everyone. Well, shouldn't I agree that that's how things often work in many cultures? And I think that particular way of thinking is not entirely dead in our culture, for that matter. But I'm not convinced that that is sort of the dominant, uncontested way that evaluative terms work in any culture, even in cultures like the very chauvinistic ones that Nietzsche is talking about. These cultures still, if someone from outside the privileged class starts behaving in the way that the privileged class is supposed to admire among themselves, being bold and aggressive and self-assertive and so forth, although that may awaken disapproval and dismay, often it can also awaken admiration. The Romans admired the Celtic leaders they found hard to defeat. They still went and happily defeated them and dragged them in chains through the streets of Rome, but nevertheless, they'd rather fight even though in some sense they might rather fight a weak and wimpy foe, they felt greater respect for the cool and admirable, strong and brave and intelligent foe, and you feel more respect for that one. And so even in chauvinistic cultures, I think there is some extent for evaluative terms to extend beyond just the in-group. But anyway, whether or not, as a matter of fact, any culture has them, suppose as a matter of fact that our evaluative terms do work like that. Suppose as a matter of fact, when we use an evaluative term, we commit ourselves to its being valuable not just for ourselves, but for everyone. That doesn't mean that that's right. You might ask, couldn't we revise our moral terms? Sometimes we do revise moral terms when we don't like what they imply. Now, what would revising them mean? Well, I don't think it could mean that we could simply take the very same moral terms and start applying them in a way that they no longer applied universally anymore. Because if it's part of the meaning of our terms, and the way the terms are used is part of what determines the meaning. If it's part of the meaning of the moral terms that they apply to everyone universally, then we can't start using them in a different way without abandoning the term. It's not the same term anymore. It's another term that sounds like it. But it's not the same term if it doesn't have the same meaning. So we couldn't use the terms differently. But the question is, could we abandon our terms and substitute other ones? Sometimes we do that. Sometimes there are terms that necessarily carry certain evaluative commitments with them. If we decide we don't like those evaluative commitments, we just stop using the term. And racial epithets are being the obvious example. You can't use them with their original meaning without committing yourself to certain evaluations. If you don't want to commit yourself to those evaluations, either you have to use the term with a different meaning or you have to stop using the term. Could we do that? Could we give up the universal implications of our evaluative terms? Well, I want to argue that we can't. Again, As is often the case this week, I don't claim to have an absolute knockdown argument against it, but I'm going to give what I think are some reasons against it. But first I want to talk about a different reason for thinking we can't give up the universal evaluative terms. And I want to argue that doesn't quite work. But some have what you might call a consistency argument. You often see this argument in moral philosophy, that evaluative terms, you have to treat them as applying to everyone. Because if I regard my pursuit of my well-being as legitimate for me, I have to regard your pursuit of your well-being as legitimate for you. It doesn't make any sense for me to treat it as okay for me and mine, but not for you, unless I can point to some actual relevant, real difference between us. And one way of telling whether it's a real relevant difference is, suppose it's like the Sneetches in Dr. Seuss, where the ones with the stars on their bellies think they're the best, and the ones without the stars aren't. And so they might say, well, the reason that these just apply to us is we have the stars. But as soon as you take the stars away, they don't say, oh, well, all right, now we should be in a subordinate position. Now they suddenly decide that not having the stars is the important feature. So, you have to find some feature that really is relevant, not one that you're just pretending is relevant. All right, fair enough, but I don't think this will get you everything you want. We have to distinguish between weak and strong universalizability of values. And here's what I mean. Suppose that, think about the way that two sports teams that are playing against each other regard each other. So Team A is doing everything it can to win against Team B, and Team B is doing everything it can to win against Team A. Well, does Team A think that Team B is wrong to be trying to win against Team A? No. Team A thinks it's perfectly legitimate for Team B to be trying to win. But that doesn't mean that Team A thinks that it should thereby be committed to letting Team B win. The attitude you have in sports is, or in any kind of, sort of competitive situation like this is, it's perfectly appropriate for you to be trying to win, but it's perfectly appropriate for me to be trying to stop you. Now in that sense, you've got a kind of universalizability. It'd be different if you said, I should be trying to win and everyone else should let me win. You have said that, then you'd sort of have a view that makes yourself special and different from everyone else. But if you don't have that, if you just say, well, I should be doing all I can to win, you should be doing all you can to win, and we'll see who wins, that would be a kind of universalizability, but it's not going to be the kind that gets you what you want morally. Now, of course, in the case of the sports teams, there is a common background of shared values that licenses this conflict. Although each of them wants a different situation. One Team A wants Team A to win, and Team B wants Team B to win. Nevertheless, they both agree on the shared background rules of sports. It's a good thing that we allow this conflict, or promote this conflict, or have this conflict happen. And so they both agree that it's a good thing that there's this institution of the sport. And you might say that both sides are better off for having this conflict. The game would be no fun if both sides agreed that Team A ought to win, and if Team B didn't do anything to stop Team A from winning, not only would Team B get no fun out of the game, but Team A would get no fun out of the game. So there are lots of cases where we have what looks like a departure from strong universality. It looks like a case where you've got these kinds of conflicts, but they're licensed by something stronger in the background. But is that always going to be the case? You can imagine someone who thinks, well, life is like the sports teams, except there are no shared norms in the background that justify this. It's just this is how it is. I go after what I want, you go after what you want, and that may not be the best situation we can imagine, but that's nevertheless what is in fact legitimate. Hobbes seems to have in mind something like this. So Hobbes says that in the state of nature, everyone has the right to do whatever they want. Well, what he means by right is simply it being, okay for them to do it. It doesn't imply that anyone else has an obligation to let them do it. So according to Hobbes, I have a right to kill you, and you have the right to stop me. So when Hobbes says I have a right to kill you, he doesn't mean a kind of right that anyone has an obligation to respect. By right, he just means something like, it's legitimate for you to do it. It's legitimate for me to try to kill you. It's legitimate, so it's like a big sports game, and Hobbes isn't saying we're all better off because these are the rules. He's just saying, this is the situation we're stuck with. This is the way it is, unless we construct some artificial alternative to get us out of it. Now, one worry I have about a lot of arguments for rights is it seems to me they often presuppose strong universalizability when they think they're establishing it, or they often presuppose it when really all they've got is weak universalizability. For example, there's an argument in Rothbard early on in the Ethics of Liberty where he's trying to argue for property rights. Actually, I think it's a perfectly good argument. It's an argument I think works only if you already presuppose this one thing that I'm asking how to prove, of strong universalizability. It's an argument where Rothbard says, well, look, suppose you've got, how do we prove that anybody owns anything? What are the options? Well, one option is that nobody owns anything, but he says, well, that means that no one would have the right to use anything, because ownership is the right to use stuff, and so no one would have the right to use any material object, including their own bodies, and so they'd all immediately have to die, and that doesn't seem to make much sense. So we should assume that there is such a thing as ownership. And so what about ownership of our own material bodies? Who owns them? And Rothbard says there are three main options. Could be that each person owns him or herself, which is obviously the option Rothbard wants to argue for. Or it could be that everyone owns an equal share of everyone else. So if there are 300 people, each person owns 1/300th of every other person, and so on. If there are 4 billion people, each one owns 1/4 of everyone else. And Rothbard argues against that on the grounds that there's no way to implement that, because you'd have to get permission from all the other 4 billion people before you could raise your arm or inhale, and that's obviously not going to work out. And then Rothbard believes is the other option, some people own other people. And he says, well, that's not going to work because it's not universalizable. It's not a principle universally applicable. An ethical system should apply to everyone. Well, I think those are good arguments as far as they go. However, I don't think that it settles this foundational question of whether there is such a thing as universalizability at all. Because imagine what a Hobbesian would say to these examples. A Hobbesian would say, well, my view is it's perfectly legitimate, whatever you mean by ownership, it's perfectly legitimate for me to do whatever I want with my body. But it's also perfectly legitimate for you to do whatever you want with my body. And you want to cut off my arm and cook it and eat it, it's perfectly legitimate for you to do it. It's also perfectly legitimate for me to do everything I can to stop you. So this is a sense of legitimate where it's being legitimate for me to do something does not imply anything about your obligation to let me do it. This is also one of the worries I have about Hans Hoppe's argument that by engaging in argument you're thereby committing yourself to the legitimacy of that person using their mind and body in order to engage in argument. Because once again, is this legitimacy in the weak universalizable or the strong universalizable sense? Because you could say, yeah, by engaging you in argument, I've granted it's perfectly legitimate for you to use your mind and body to argue, but it's also perfectly legitimate for me to cook and eat you. So we need the strong universalizability in order to make these arguments work. Now, can we get it? Now, of course, you could say, well, in one sense we already have it, because I'm claiming that the evaluative terms we already have are ones that already have this commitment to strong universalizability built into them. But still, then the question we have to ask is, what do we say about someone who thinks we should give it up? Can we coherently give it up? And I'd like to be able to show that we can't coherently give up the strong universalizability that's built into our evaluative terms. Okay, why not? Well, a number of philosophers have stressed, as part of their argument for why we should care about other people, a lot of them have stressed that we have a need to admire oneself. You find this in Socrates, in Aristotle, in David Hume, in Adam Smith. Hume talks about being able to bear our own survey. And part of what they mean is that when you step back and look at yourself, you want to be able to find in yourself the same traits that you admire in others. But you could ask, why that's the case. You can imagine someone saying, look, what I want to see in other people is slave values. What I want to see in myself is master values. And when I step back and look at myself, I have very different standards from what I want when I step back and look at other people. Now, what Hume and Smith do is they try to base strong universalizability on certain innate psychological tendencies we have. It's just a fact about human beings that we have these natural sympathies, that we just have this natural tendency to put ourselves in other people's shoes, to see ourselves from other people's point of view, and and ultimately to see ourselves from a kind of objective or neutral point of view, and that therefore they think there's a reason that we need to harmonize the kinds of traits we want to see in other people with the kinds of traits we want to see in ourselves. And I think there's something to that. I mean, I wouldn't agree with all the details, but I do think that they're on the right track there. But the problem is, if you make this purely a psychological claim, it's just a psychological claim that we have this tendency. I have the same kind of worry about it that you might have about in Austrian economics you might have about basing an economic principle on empirical data rather than trying to defend it conceptually. Because it may be true that we have a natural tendency to step outside of ourselves and view ourselves objectively and try to bring into harmony the traits we see in ourselves with the traits we see in others. We have a lot of natural tendencies. We have a tendency to this tendency toward sort of interpersonal objectivity, but also we have tendencies toward bias and toward ignoring other people's viewpoints and just doing whatever we want to do. Clearly, human beings have both those tendencies. You see both those tendencies around all the time. So why should we pursue one of those rather than the other? If they're just sort of psychological facts, it's not clear where does their normative punch come from. So it'd be nice to have something more like a conceptual argument. Well, here's at least part of the move I want to make as to why I think we can't get rid of this strong universalizability in our evaluative terms. So first I want to claim that rational agency requires language, that you couldn't have rational agents without language. Now you might doubt that. You might say, well, we need language to communicate our thoughts, but we could think perfectly well without language, or even perfectly well. We could think well enough to count as rational agents without language. I'm not convinced of that. Part of the reason I'm not convinced of that is what I was talking about this morning, where you don't count as a mental state unless you're capable of expressing it in certain ways. And I have trouble seeing how you could express, how you could have thoughts that you didn't have any means of expressing in language. So I tend to think of language not just as a means of communication, but actually as a vehicle of thought. Now that's a philosophically controversial claim, but anyway, it's the one I do sign on to. All right, although I don't think that language is merely a means of communicating thought you already have, I think that it is that language is also a vehicle of thought. I do think that the communicative dimension is essential in the following sense, that speaking language involves acquiescing in essentially shareable norms. Now, this touches on what sometimes called Wittgenstein's private language argument, and there are a lot of different interpretations of exactly what it means. Wittgenstein says a private language is impossible. I think he's right, but let me say a bit about what I think that means. By a private language, I don't mean a language that only one person knows. When Tolkien created Elvish, or actually two strains of Elvish, before he published any of that, he was the only person on earth who knew Elvish, the original speakers of it having died out millennia ago. Whoever it was who developed Klingon, I don't know if that was one person or a group, but let's say it was one person. The first person who came up with Klingon was at one time the only person on earth who spoke Klingon. So there's a sense of private language, which those were private languages. That's not the sense I mean, because although they were languages that no one else actually spoke, they were languages the rules of which were generally applicable. In other words, that the rules are such that anyone saying Ail Breth Gilthaniel means the same thing as anyone else saying Ail Breth Gilthaniel, even if there was a time when Tolkien was the only person on earth who had ever said Ail Breth Gilthaniel, and I forget what it means. Something like, oh, Elbreth, you're really cool, or something like that. But to say that the language was not private is not to say that, there couldn't have been the case that only one person might ever have spoken it. Tolkien could have died before, and his notebooks could have been burned before anyone else ever knew any of it. But the rules were essentially shareable. The norms of language were essentially shareable. Now you could say, could you construct a language where the rules of it are such that only you can understand the meaning of it, so that when I say Gropzik, that means table for me. But not only will it not mean table if you say it, but it won't even mean table to you when you hear it. You can't you can't understand it as meeting table. It's only something in my own little world. It's a language you in principle could not learn. It's only my language. Well, I don't think that makes sense. I think that language by its very nature involves a shareable norm. Now, what follows from that? Well, some thinkers have thought that something about morality follows fairly directly from norms governing language. You can find this in Habermas, you can find it in Hans Hoppe. Take norms governing language or governing interpersonal linguistic communication and try and build ethical or political norms directly out of that. That's not what I'm going to recommend, but what I am recommending is something in common with the spirit of that. Here's why I don't want to recommend that approach. First of all, I don't think it's a promising approach. I don't think it's going to get you what you want in the way of content, because the norms governing linguistic communication are much more permissive than the norms governing ethics. I think that I can succeed in engaging. I could succeed in having a conversation with you while I'm torturing you to death. The conversation wouldn't be that fun for you, but it would be a conversation. I could follow all the norms necessary to succeed in having a conversation with you, without obviously doing anything particularly moral. So I don't think that this is going to get you something ethical. But also, I don't think it's necessary. I don't think you need to get ethics out of the norms of language per se, by the particular content of linguistic norms. But rather, I want to get something to the fact that they are, in some sense, agent neutral. If part of what it is to speak a language is to have norms that are in some sense agent neutral, and if any rational agent has to be a language speaker, then any rational agent has some agent neutral norms. Now, the norms might just be, stuff about governing language use. They're not moral norms yet, but there is an agent neutral dimension to their value. Now, you needn't necessarily think of this agent neutral as being in conflict with or opposed to or contradistinguished from agent relative value. You could see it as something something that's already built into agent relative value, or however you want to put it, but there it is. Which means that once you've got such a thing as agent neutral value, even if thus far it only applies to things about language, then you've got a perspective you otherwise wouldn't have. You've got an agent neutral perspective from which you could raise questions about the evaluation of action from an agent neutral perspective, even though you haven't as yet gotten that far. So far you're just talking about language. But now there's sort of a standpoint from which to raise those questions. And otherwise there wouldn't be. Because I think the real worry a lot of people have is there's just no such thing as an agent neutral standpoint. We can't find any basis for thinking there could be such a thing. And what I'm suggesting is, well, for any being that speaks language, there is such a standpoint. There is, we already have agent neutrality on the table. Well, why should we care about that ethically? Why should we think that that would get us anything? Well, here I am inspired by a point that Socrates often seems to be making. Socrates thinks that once you recognize a category of value, you're committed to wanting to integrate it in with your other values. Now, I don't have a full-fledged argument for that. I hope to have, but I find the view plausible and attractive, that somehow, the example that Socrates gives is a bit different from this one. The example Socrates gives is, in Plato's Gorgias, for example, he's arguing with this guy Polus about which is better, justice or injustice. And Polus, in effect, says, well, justice is morally better than injustice. It's more admirable, sure. But injustice is more advantageous. So injustice is more worth having, even though justice is more worth admiring. But the point Socrates pushes him on is, can you really regard something as more worth admiring, and yet regard it as not worth having? Can you really recognize a certain kind of value, and yet still regard your life as worth having without that kind of value in it? Well, this is a somewhat different kind of case, but this is the kind of case where I want to push something analogous. Say that once you recognize that there is such a thing as agent neutral value, even if you see it simply as an aspect of agent relative value rather than something as distinct, once you've got that, then you've got a standpoint from which questions can always be asked about the the justification of this from other people's standpoints. Now, agent neutral value, I don't mean some sort of platonic good floating off independent from what anyone wants, if that's what Plato meant. So you could think of it as maybe sort of more of an intersubjective value rather than simply a value that leaves agents behind altogether. So you could say, well, it's a shared value or a shareable value. But it seems to me that once you've got this shared value perspective, once there is such a thing as this way of viewing the world, then you can't logically be indifferent to questions about the evaluation of your actions from a shared perspective. So take, for example, the standard line that people often use when they're, let's say, raising children and teaching them to be moral. If you don't do that, you wouldn't like that if someone did it to you. You can imagine why a Hobbesian might say, well, why on earth is that relevant? Unless you just mean, they better watch out that, they don't come back with stronger friends. Why should I, you might say, well, of course, I sure wouldn't like it if they did it to me. I'm glad it's me doing it to them instead. So why is there any force to this question? You wouldn't like it how would you like it if they did it to you? It seems as though that question has some kind of force. It seems as though it makes sense. It doesn't mean it's always effective. Saying it to someone doesn't necessarily make them recognize or change. But it does seem as though it makes sense to ask that question. And what I want to say is that any being that speaks language is open to that question. Because there's a foothold for stepping outside of this sort of solipsistic perspective. Again, none of that adds up to a knockdown argument for anything. If I can work any of that into a knockdown argument, I certainly will, but I haven't yet. But that is what I'm tempted by. Now, there was a time when I thought I didn't need any of that stuff at all. There was a time when I wanted to go purely agent-relative, and then try and build concern for others out of some purely agent-relative thing. But again, that was all pre-Wittgenstein, and Wittgenstein affected me in various ways. For better or for worse, I can't judge, but since I am, I'm within the perspective that created. But certainly this sort of private language thing has influenced me in thinking, well, maybe there's something to this agent neutrality after all. Well, so what I want to claim is that once you recognize agent neutral value, then that enables you to take an agent neutral perspective on your own actions and on your own character. And then you're going to want to integrate what can be agent neutrally endorsed into your conception of your own eudaimonia. So that if you can't find fully satisfying a life that can't be endorsed from the agent neutral standpoint, then you're going to regard agent neutral endorsement as something to want to make part of your eudaimonia. I suppose it's not just Wittgenstein that influenced me on this. It was on reading Adam Smith's Theory of Moral Sentiments, where I found I kept resisting the psychologism of it. He was trying to boil everything down to these innate psychological impulses and natural sympathies we have, and I didn't like that. But it kept striking me there was something right about this idea of stepping outside of our own solipsistic perspective and seeing something from another person's point of view. And someone who started off as a quasi-Randian, I have to figure, well, how do I reconcile that with sort of my eudaimonistic sympathies? And so I'm trying to cram all these different things together into a single theory. So my theory is rich. But it seems to me there's something right about Smith. There's also something right about the eudaimonist view that it's your own, it's sort of your own flourishing that you are promoting, and I want to make sense of how I can have it all. All right. So suppose I want to integrate this agent neutral perspective into my own conception of my own good. So somehow concern for others' interests has to be integrated into my own good. Well, how do I do it? Well, you can imagine different ways it could go. I might just hold fixed, because I want to construct, I'm trying to construct my conception of my own good by building other people's interests into it. But remember, I'm also trying to construct my conception of what other people's interests are by the fact that they're sort of in reciprocal determination with my own. I'm trying to come up with a conception of self-interest, both of mine and of other people's, that will allow them all sort of to be integrated into each other. Now, I could just start off with with sort of a prima facie account of self-interest, and then just say, well, then we'll just integrate that, and say that what everyone ought to do is, so we sort of master morality without any slaves. It would be one where everyone goes around being self-assertive and aggressive because I want that for myself, and so I then, from the agent neutral perspective, I'm committed to wanting that for everyone else. So everyone goes around, pushing and shoving. It's like New York. And, that could be what you do. You hold fixed the initial prima facie conception of self-interest, and then you go from there and everywhere else. Well, you could go the other way. Think about the way I like other people to treat me, and think, well, I should be more like that. And so I start off with some prima facie account of the way I want other people to treat me, which is just, they're, being really, really helpful to me and putting what I want first. And so I think, well, then I should be like that too. And I try to build that into my conception of happiness. So then you get a situation where everyone's sort of deferring to everyone else, and everyone's being really nice and unique, and no one ever pushes for anything, but everyone's constantly deferring to everyone else. It's sort of like what Herbert Spencer thought would be the ultimate pinnacle of civilization. Which Nietzsche read that and reacted with horror. But it seems to me that neither of those is going to be quite the right story, because each of them involves holding one conception fixed and sort of adapting everything else to fit it. So in one case, I hold my conception of self-interest fixed, and then how people are supposed to treat other people gets completely adapted to fit that. In the other case, I hold my prima facie conception of how you ought to treat other people, how other people ought to treat me fixed, and then I adapt my own conception of self-interest to fit that. But it's even more likely that it would be a matter of mutual adjustment, that if I'm trying to bring my conception of my self-interest in line with concern for others' interests, I'm also trying to bring my conception of their self-interest in line with my thinking that they also should be concerned for mine, it's not going to be all one way. It's going to mean some kind of reciprocal determination, where it's not going to be all pushing and shoving, but it's also not going to be all complete self-abnegation. Now, the fact that I'm trying to give a conceptual defense or praxeological defense or a priori defense or something like that of his concern for others, but I'm trying to do it along the same lines that Hume and Smith did, except that they did it by appealing to these natural sympathies. And I'm trying to say, no, we don't need that, we can go a priori. You might think, well, that's odd. Well, it might be odd for more than one reason, but at least the main reason you might think it's odd is it suggests that our natural sympathies are irrelevant. Hume said, and Smith said, look at these natural sympathies we have. Look at the fact that you naturally wince if you see someone hit in the face with a shovel. It's just your natural reaction is to wince, as though you were feeling their pain a little bit. We just have this natural tendency to put ourselves in other people's shoes. And that explains where this comes from. Now, if I come along and say, no, it's got nothing to do with those natural sympathies. It's really this a priori argument that any rational agent is committed to taking up an agent-neutral perspective. Then you get the odd result that here, in fact, we obviously have these natural sympathies. I mean, if you read the things that Hume and Smith say, it certainly seems right to say that we do have these tendencies they talk about. And it does seem as though beings with tendencies like those would tend to develop something like moral norms, or something that looks at least kind of like moral norms, has a similar shape. And then I come along and say, well, those natural sympathies are irrelevant. I can get these moral norms purely out of the a priori. The reason that might seem odd is you might say, well, here we have all these natural sympathies that tend toward what you're talking about, and you want to say there's just a coincidence. That we have the content of morality would be exactly the same if we didn't have these natural sympathies. And isn't that suspicious? Isn't that unlikely? Well, I think what I would prefer to say is that I don't think it's irrelevant, but what I think is that it might be that only beings that had those natural sympathies would be capable of rationality. Any rational agent has to be able to take up an agent-neutral perspective, but maybe only beings that have capacities for sympathy could take up an agent-neutral perspective, so that maybe there couldn't be, a species of Hobbesian language users, a purely Hobbesian attitude toward other people. And again, that's simplifying Hobbes. Hobbes does not have Hobbes doesn't actually advocate what we call a purely Hobbesian attitude toward other people. It's more complicated, but so it might be that the right thing to say is that only beings that are capable of putting themselves in each other's shoes could get the kind of degree of impersonal perspective to enable them even to grasp language. That you couldn't grasp language unless you were capable of stepping outside of yourself, and that only if you have certain kinds of emotional reactions are you capable of stepping outside of yourself. Okay, so I've said that we should, that we're committed to taking up some sort of agent-neutral perspective on ourselves and not endorsing anything unless it can be endorsed from an agent-neutral perspective. Well, you might think this would generate utilitarianism. You might say, all right, well, then we have to treat all people's interests equally. They all have to count equally. If we all count equally, then you just do whatever maximizes most of them, since you can't satisfy all of them, and therefore you get utilitarianism. Why isn't that the upshot of this? Well, more than one reason, but one reason at least is this. I've said a bit about this before, but I'll say it again. I think that utilitarianism is praxeologically unstable. And here's why. I've got, this is the standard distinction. Whenever I make a distinction that's not on the handout, I different colored pen this time. There's a distinction that's often drawn between rule utilitarianism and act utilitarianism. And the way this distinction works is sometimes the best way to get what you want is not to aim at it directly. For example, here I have a digital watch. Suppose I went back in time to the 17th century and handed someone this digital watch, and assuming they didn't burn me at the stake, I need to choose my company carefully, they might be really impressed and say, oh, well, we want to do scientific and technological research. We want digital watches too. We want to pursue some line of research which would bring that about. Well, what line of research would they pursue? And what line of research should they pursue? Well, if you wanted this line of scientific research that is going to end up with digital watches like this, with these, this liquid crystal display and so on, what you really need is an understanding of electronics. And to get that, you need an understanding of electromagnetism. And to get that, you need to be studying lightning and stuff like that. You need to be doing whatever it was Benjamin Franklin was doing with lightning. Apparently, the traditional story that he was running around with a kite and a key is dubious. Best evidence against it is that he survived that period of his life. But I don't know whether that's what he did or not. But anyway, that sort of thing, whatever it was he was doing, is the sort of thing you need to do in order to end up with stuff like this. But in the 17th century, no one looking at this watch would guess that studying lightning would be a useful way of getting this watch. Instead, they would have thought something to do with clockmaking. And there was lots of study of clockmaking and gears and so forth, and they would have studied clockmaking more, and that would have been a dead end. That wouldn't lead to this at all. So there's a famous point made by Francis Bacon. Now, Francis Bacon was one of the first philosophers of science to think that the point of science is the technological goodies it brings us. Before him, the dominant view was the Aristotelian view that the point of science is just knowledge for its own sake. And Bacon said, no, who cares about knowledge for its own sake? The benefit of science is technological goodies. Given that, you might have thought that Bacon would have said that we should change the way we do research, and that we should direct our research more toward practical ends. But he didn't. He thought that you should do scientific research as though you cared about knowledge for its own sake. And the way he put it is you should look for experiments of light, not experiments of fruit. By which he meant not a preference for optics over horticulture, but do experiments that will shed light on general principles, as opposed to experiments that are designed to yield some specific practical result. And his argument for this was, it's difficult to know ahead of time exactly, since you don't know the principles involved, it's difficult to know ahead of time exactly which experiments will lead to which practical results. But an insight into general principles is more likely in the long run to lead to more useful applications, even if you don't know ahead of time exactly what they are. And so although he thought that the point of science was technological goodies, he thought you shouldn't do science aiming at technological goodies. You should do science as though you cared about the research for its own sake. Well, applying this issue to utilitarianism, a lot of people have suggested that even if the ultimate good is, even if you think the point of morality is to promote the common welfare, doesn't necessarily mean that you should be trying to promote that directly. And suppose you're a referee in a game, and you're a philosophical referee, and you start reflecting on your role in the game, and you think, well, what's my point here? Well, my point is to facilitate the game. Well, what's the point of the game? Suppose you decide that the point of the game is to provide pleasure to the spectators. I don't know whether that's quite the right story. It's probably oversimplification. But let's say that's it. I decide the point of this game is to provide pleasure to the spectators. So I might then conclude, all right, and when I make my calls, I decide if someone is safe or out or whatever, I should be guided not by the rules of the game, but by whatever ruling will give the most pleasure to the spectators. And so when I'm trying to decide something, I don't look in the rule book. Instead, I think, well, is this a home game or away game? If it's a home game, all right, so most of the spectators are favoring Team A, so I should make a ruling that favors Team A. Well, that may maximize the pleasure of the spectators in the short run. But in the long run, the spectators will pretty quickly realize that whether a team wins or loses has nothing to do with actually how it plays. And then you'll easily predict who's going to win just by counting how many people in the stands are for a particular team, and then you have not maximized the pleasure of the spectators, quite the contrary. Or take another famous example. Suppose that you're a doctor and you've got 5 patients and each one needs a different organ transplant. One needs a lung and one needs a liver and one needs a heart and so on. And they're all in desperate need and you don't have any donors, and then a perfectly healthy patient walks into your clinic for a routine checkup, and it occurs to you that if you kill him, you can redistribute his organs to the other 5, and you save 5 lives at the cost of 1. You might think utilitarianism recommends this, because you try and maximize as many people's interests as possible. But many utilitarians will point out, in fact, utilitarianism doesn't recommend this, because in general, if you adopt a general policy that the few can always be sacrificed to the many, well, although everyone's a member of the many, everyone's also a member of some few or other, so everyone's a potential object of sacrifice. And so if there's a general rule in society that any individual can be sacrificed to the group, the whole group is going to be less happy. They're going to be much more nervous, thinking that any one of them could be next. And so therefore the whole group will be more happy if you adopt a general rule saying that no one can be sacrificed. So this is the idea of rule utilitarianism, which is that you don't simply choose your actions on a case-by-case basis. You try to figure out which general policies are the most beneficial, and you stick to those general policies as though you thought that they were valuable for their own sake. Now, in fact, I think praxeology shows, because Austrian economics shows, that you produce more total prosperity for society if you stick to certain general principles, like voluntary exchange and so on. But, so act utilitarianism is praxeologically incoherent, I think, because praxeological analysis itself shows that if you act on act utilitarianism, you end up making everyone worse off, which is the opposite of what you wanted. So rule utilitarianism seems the only defensible version of utilitarianism. But I claim that rule utilitarianism is also praxeologically incoherent. Why is that? Well, because in effect, what rule utilitarianism is advocating is that there are certain things that in order to gain some good or other, you should treat certain means as though they were ends in themselves. But my question is, what does it mean to treat something as though it's an end in itself? I mean, either you treat it as an end in itself or you don't. Either you adopt it as an end or you treat it as a mere means. If you treat it as mere means, then you're always going to be open to arguments for departing from the rule, because here you have the patient who walks into your clinic, and your first thought is, hey, I can kill this patient and redistribute his organs. And your next thought is, oh no, a general policy of doing that would be bad for society. But your third thought could be, well, I'm not enacting a general policy here. I'm just doing my one little action. As long as I can do it and I can make it look like an accident and no one knows about it, I'm not undermining the general respect. So I might as well do it. And of course, if all the rule utilitarians reason that way, then they're just going to act exactly like act utilitarians, and the bad results will ensue. So this seems like a case for saying that you should commit yourself to treating these things as though they really are ends in themselves. Well, fine, but once you do that, I claim you're not a utilitarian anymore. Because if you've really committed yourself, then you really do care about these means for their own sake now. Maybe your reason for getting yourself to care about them was a utilitarian one, but that was sort of a ladder and you picked it away. Some of the ancient Epicureans had this argument about friendship. People said to them, oh, well, you Epicureans are egoists. You only regard your friends as means to your own happiness, which I think to some extent might be right because the Epicureans didn't really have the same kind of eudaimonious conception as these other guys. They didn't really think of, for the most part, although it's slippery, they didn't really think of other things as being components of happiness. They really did think of happiness as a mental state and things being means to it. So I don't really include the Epicureans in my gang of Platonists and Aristotelians and Stoics and Scholastics, although they had some eudaimonious aspects. But anyway, some of the Epicureans responded by saying, no, it is true that we ought to care about the friend for the friend's own sake, but here's why. You'll get much greater pleasure out of the friendship if you value the friend for the friend's own sake. So therefore, you have a perfectly good egoistic reason to get yourself to care about the friend for the friend's own sake. And I would say, all right, fine. You've got an instrumentalist reason for trying to get yourself into a certain frame of mind. But once you've got yourself into that frame of mind, it seems to me that your attitude toward your friend is no longer instrumental. You had an instrumental reason for adopting non-instrumental concern. But once you've got a non-instrumental concern for your friend, you're not an egoist in the narrow Epicurean sense anymore. So likewise, I want to say, yeah, there are good utilitarian reasons to get yourself to be committed to certain principles of justice for their own sake. But once you've committed yourself to those principles of justice for their own sake, then you've waved bye-bye to utilitarianism. Now, as I mentioned before, and as I will go into more detail again, that doesn't mean that I think consequentialist reasons are irrelevant or unimportant in ethics. On the contrary, I think that there's once again something to integrate into a larger picture. I think that consequentialist considerations can play a role in specifying the content of some of our moral duties. But I think it goes the other way around too. What counts as a good consequence should be influenced by some of our views about moral duties. Now, there was a time when I thought that consequences were largely irrelevant for the content of, or at least the content of libertarian rights. I thought libertarian rights held regardless of the consequences. And the reason I came to change my mind about that is not the reason you might think. You might think, well, here's someone who used to think that you could or should defend libertarian rights on sort of purely non-consequentialist grounds, and now they start bringing consequentialist considerations in. That must mean that they think that the non-consequentialist arguments aren't so good, and so they need help from the consequentialist ones. But actually, it wasn't that. It wasn't that I became less impressed by the non-consequentialist arguments, is that I became more impressed by the consequentialist ones, in the sense that I thought, these consequentialist arguments for libertarian rights are really, really good. And it would be really weird if the fact that they're so good were totally irrelevant to why libertarian rights are correct. It would just be sort of an amazing coincidence that although the fact that they bring about peace and prosperity and progress in society is just this happy, useful fact, it's got nothing to do with why libertarianism is right. And that's the same kind of worry that I said someone might have about natural sympathies, where we've got all these natural sympathies and they support a certain viewpoint, but in fact that viewpoint is right for a reason that has nothing to do with the natural sympathies. I wanted to avoid saying that. So likewise, it would be really weird if here you have the thick volumes of human action and man, economy, and state, and they give all these reasons why you get much, much better consequences, much more better social cooperation and prosperity and so forth if you have a libertarian system. But if it turned out that all of that is irrelevant to why libertarianism is right, it's just a happy coincidence, but that human action and man, economy, and state have nothing to tell us about why libertarianism is a good idea, I think that would just be odd. So it's not that I love deontology less, but that I love consequentialism more. Not more than deontology, but more than I had before. So it seems to me that it would be odd if consequentialist considerations weren't part of the story about why libertarian rights are correct. Of course, I also don't think that they are the main story. I think that they're just concern for consequences is part of our moral point of view, but not the whole thing. And I'll have more to say about that tomorrow.